On today's special crossover edition of Locked On Blue Jackets and Locked On Wild, Dean Evason makes his return to the XL Energy Center. Should be some sparks, right?
Hey, this is Matt Boldy, and you're listening to Locked On Wild.
You're Locked On Wild, your daily podcast on the Minnesota Wild. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's happening, everybody? Welcome into a special crossover edition of Locked On Blue Jackets and Locked On Wilds. We are your daily podcast for the Columbus Blue Jackets and the Minnesota Wild. We thank you for making both shows your first listen each and every day. We are your team each and every day as well. Make sure to subscribe on YouTube and your favorite podcast platforms so you don't miss out on any new episodes throughout the week with the season in full swing. Today's episode of Locked On Blue Jackets and Locked On Wild is brought to you by GameTime. Download the GameTime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off your first purchase. On today's crossover, we get you ready for the start of the season as Jay Foster of Locked On Blue Jackets joins us to preview the opening night matchup between the Wild and the Blue Jackets. We'll talk about what obviously has been a very heavy and tragic offseason for Columbus. We'll talk about Dean Evason's return to the XL Energy Center, and we'll talk some Wild here as well today. My name is Seth Toupal, host of Locked On Wilds, credentialed media member, and host of the show since 2021. As mentioned, we're joined by Jay Foster of Locked On Blue Jackets. Jay, it's time. The season has begun. Happy to have you with here to break down game one.
Yeah, it's going to be a time. Am I talking about the game? Am I talking about the season? No one really knows, but here it is. It's been, like you said, it's been a long off season. It's been a rough off season. Kind of a complete opposite in shift in terms of tone from the last time we spoke, when we were all so optimistic and so excited. And now I'm like, how do we get through this season? But we do it a game at a time.
Yeah.
And the Wild is not a terrible first game, I feel like.
Yeah, and we'll dive into the specifics here at the end of the show. But obviously, you hit on the A topic, and let's just go right there first for Columbus. Obviously, something that nobody wants to have happen during any season at all, any point of the season. And especially somebody who was as universally beloved as Johnny Gaudreau was. Both him and his brother were killed in the offseason in a tragic situation in which they were home for their sister's wedding, killed by a drunk driver. Just awful. It hit everybody hard, and I can only imagine that it's something that the Blue Jackets will be going through the entire season. Like there's no manual on this. It's just something that they're going to have to process throughout the entirety of the season, which is obviously like it's a tough blow, and it's not something that is going to heal immediately. Like it's just going to be a wound that's going to be there for a long time.
Yeah, 100%. Like you said, it's probably one of the toughest days of hosting this podcast is kind of recording the episode immediately after Johnny and his brother passed away, which, just over a month ago. Now it still feels extremely, extremely recent. But it's so tough because of that. And like, not even in terms of an on ice impact, because obviously Johnny Gaudreau was a difference maker on the ice, off the ice. By all accounts, every single person that's ever interacted with him has a great story to tell about him, like the big balls of plain pasta. A personal favorite of mine is the time he didn't take any shoes apart from his game day shoes to Florida. So he just wore shorts and dress shoes when the team went out, like during the day, which, is always going to make me smile. But this is a guy, like, he was everyone's favorite player that didn't play for their team. You know, he was the guy that, hey, who's your favorite player that isn't on your team? And 9 times out of 10, the answer is Johnny Gaudreau. So it's a huge loss. Like, emotionally, hockey-wise, like, there's no way around that. They do not have you can't replace a player like that, even if you just kind of go in terms of pure hockey. How do you replace a 60-point player a month before the season starts? Like, you don't. So the Blue Jackets have kind of had to make the best of a bad situation. The hits keep coming. Boone Jenner and Dmitry Voronkov. Seemingly nothing injuries that have turned into, well, they're probably going to be out until the spring. Boone Jenner got hurt in practice. Dmitry Voronkov got hurt 15 seconds into a game in the preseason. Like, it just feels endless. And not to, like, compare one tragedy with, like, a season-ending injury, but, like, God, when do the Blue Jackets get a break?
Yeah.
You know? So, like I said, the last time we spoke, we were all smiles, all optimism. This team was going to make the playoffs and was going to be great. Now I'm kind of like, man, let's just get through the season. And it's so tough to predict. I've been thinking a lot about this recently in terms of, like, the Blue Jackets season specifically, because it really could go either way. You know, this team could rally around each other. They could use the grief to kind of really come together as a team. They could surprise everyone, and they could basically just kind of bully their way into the playoffs in memory of Gaudreau, you know? Or they could fall apart. And there is absolutely nothing wrong with that. I'm not saying that that's, like, a failing on their part of anything. Like, if I had a coworker that I, you know, really liked and saw every day, and then he died unexpectedly, and then I had to go to work the next day, and 20,000 people were going to be watching me at work, like, I shouldn't be bringing my best self, you know? So I really have no idea which way this is going to go for the Blue Jackets in terms of, are they going to rally, or are they going to, like, just kind of, is that grief going to be too heavy?
Yeah.
There's no way to know.
It's something too that I think nobody is going to, if it ends up being something that they are not able to move past, not one single person in the NHL is going to fault them for that, because it's a situation that is just completely, like, beyond control.
Yeah.
And so
genuinely don't know the last time this has happened. Like, the closest thing that this happened to this is when the Miami Marlins lost a young star pitcher mid-season.
Jose Fernandez.
2016. But this hasn't happened in hockey in a long time, if ever.
Yeah.
Your star player that you are building the team around, his best friend just signed long-term to come and play with him for the next 5 years. And then, you know, it's, like I said, there is no manual for this. There is no roadmap for this. There is no way to predict how this is going to go. The team could go 0-82, and I don't think any one person will be able to sit here and be like, well, they should have done better, you know? So, which I guess is not a silver lining necessarily, but, like, the expectations for this team are they show up and they try.
Mm-hmm.
You know, the expectations for this team 6 weeks ago were playoffs, or just short of missing out on playoffs. You know, brand new GM, brand new coach, bunch of new faces, young guys taking steps forward. To now we're looking at this of, like, they've kind of scrumbled together a roster based on waiver pickups and PTOs and, you know, things like that. And so it kind of, they really have made the best of a bad situation.
Mm-hmm.
A really, really bad situation, you know?
Yeah.
So it is what it is. It sucks, but hockey, it's back. And I think it's probably going to be a relief for a lot of them, and that they can think about playing hockey and not think about how Johnny Gaudreau is not here anymore, you know?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point too, is that you can use it as a kind of an escape to just get back to the normal routine, or as normal as it can be, can, I think, help a lot of those guys with just trying to continue to grapple with this. Like, I've said this before, you know, no one processes grief the same way. Like, there's no, okay, you're going to be over this in 4 weeks. It pops up at the most random times. the most just seemingly out of nowhere sorts of things can lead to, the grief coming back. And so it's going to be a long process.
And I think it's going to be a tough night for the Wild as well, because they're kind of opposite this.
Yeah.
Like how do you prepare for a game like that? If you're the Wild, you've got this team that's coming in that has been basically ripped apart by tragedy. How do you sit here and how do you prepare to play against that team? Because obviously you want to win, but I feel like there has to be an acknowledgement of, man, this team is really going through something.
Mm-hmm.
How do we deal with that? How do we welcome them into this building? Obviously, Wild home opener, emotions are going to be high on both sides. Return of Dean Evason, which I'm sure we'll get into in a minute. There's lots of storylines here, but yeah, I don't envy any team that has to play against the Blue Jackets this season, especially in this early going where we're still kind of figuring out what is this team going to be.
Yeah, that's well said. A couple of other big notable items for the Blue Jackets this offseason. Obviously, Patrik Laine was dealt to the Canadiens. What were you surprised by the return in that? The Blue Jackets attached, I believe it was a second round pick to move the entirety of the salary, or was that always going to be the best outcome? Was getting that cap off the books? And that's another thing too that has kind of changed since since everything's gone down.
Exactly. And I think it happened literally 2 weeks before Gaudreau passed away, so we were all, and that was something that I liked about the trade was okay, in a couple of years, we're going to have some big contracts to pay out. Adam Fantilli is going to be coming off his entry level deal, and hopefully we'll want to lock him up to, this long term, the Tim Stützle, Lucas Raymond type contract, so we're going to have to find $8 million from somewhere. We might as well try and get rid of the entire Laine contract. We were never going to get a great return because he had very publicly wanted out.
Yeah.
Which 100% his right. I'm not going to sit here and criticize him for that. I am fully in favor of players saying, hey, I don't want to be here anymore. I'm really unhappy here. I would like to go somewhere else. Great. Good for you. Obviously the Canadiens season hasn't really started how they hoped, with Laine out 2 to 3 months, I think, with a knee injury. But the Blue Jackets got a good piece back in Jordan Harris, so I'm really excited about. And a second round pick is a second round pick. In hindsight, would I have liked a different trade that maybe we did retain some salary and keep that second round pick? Sure, but I'm not going to sit here and argue about $4 million and a second round pick. They did that again. Don Waddell did the best he could with the situation that was handed to him by the problems created by the previous management. So
yeah, I think that's again, at some point, if a player doesn't want to be on your team, you do what you need to do to make sure that happens. And clearing up that money, like you said, there are going to be some contracts that are going to have to be thrown out here within the next few years, so having that money available is going to help down the line.
Exactly. And we didn't know that we were going to have an extra $9.25 or $9.75 million of cap space. Again, it feels weird to talk about it in terms of something as silly as hindsight, but they had no way to know that they were this was going to happen. So again, they were we want to get out from under this cap hit. We don't want to have we don't want to have retention on this salary. That's fine. In hindsight, could you maybe have retained on the salary and gotten a better return, knowing that you were going to have this? I think they have just over $20 million in cap space right now. It is what it is. It sucks, but
yeah, there's not much.
I'm excited about Jordan Harris, and I'm glad that Patrik Laine is somewhere that he can potentially, hopefully start to be happier, more like himself. I really hope that he comes back from this injury and is just an absolute monster for Canadians.
Yeah.
He's a really good guy. I think he deserves some happiness in his hockey. He's had a miserable couple of seasons in Columbus, not through anything that Columbus did or he did, but I would love to see him tear it up for the Canadiens. So
yeah, 100%.
About as good as it could be, in my opinion.
Yeah. Let's finish the Columbus portion by talking about Dean because, again, I thought at the time of him being hired by the Blue Jackets that he could help kind of bring order to this team and to help get them on the right track. Is he the guy that, ultimately gets them to like a serious playoff contender? Remains to be seen, but I'm going to reinforce what I said because of, the fact that Dean is a player's coach. I think he is probably as good of a fit as you could have to try to navigate something like this. And again, there's no there's no manual for how to handle this type of a situation. But if anybody's going to be able to get this team through it and to try to rally them together, I think Dean can do a good job of that.
Yeah. I have been frustrated by Dean Evason throughout the preseason for a lot of the reasons that we talked about in that original crossover. He weighs heavily, he leans heavily on veterans. If something's not working, then he just keeps trying it until it does start working. I am intensely frustrated by the fact that the younger players are being buried underneath the veterans. There's some extremely questionable choices being made in terms of like defensive deployments. That being said, something I've been thinking about a lot is Dean Evason, I feel like, is a coach that can turn a team into more than the sum of its parts. In the same way that John Tortorella did when he first came into Columbus. Like, if people who are not super familiar with what that roster looked like when John Tortorella took over in, I want to say 2016, the team had just gone 0-8 to start the season. They bring in Tortorella. You look at that roster, like the fact that he managed to claw that team into a playoff booth for a playoff berth for 3 straight seasons is nothing short of incredible. Trust me. And I wouldn't be surprised to see the same thing from Dean Evason. I think he's gotten a lot from don't take the strong way, Wild fans. I think he has gotten a lot from a Wild roster that is probably not as good on paper as it has performed. I think they have outperformed the on paper roster over the past couple of seasons. I think that's fair to say. As someone who is an outsider, who is really only kind of paying attention to the Wild when I'm in Minnesota or when the Blue Jackets are playing my team. And if you can do the same thing in Columbus, great. I think, like you said, again, how do you imagine getting a new job as the manager of somewhere and then you go there and then 2 weeks later, you're like most important employee passes away suddenly, and you have to kind of guide the entire team through this. It's not a job that I would envy anyone, but I'm glad that they have a more experienced coach to guide them through this, as opposed to, a first-time NHL head coach, for example, or a guy that's only got a couple of years experience.
Yeah, I think that if anybody's going to be equipped to handle it, I think Dean can navigate that. So let's flip to a little Wild conversation here. Jay, I'll let you ask any burning Wild questions that come to mind so that your listeners can get a little more familiar with their opponent here for this first game of the season. We'll talk Wild as we continue today's special crossover edition of Locked On Blue Jackets and Locked On Wild after this. Today's episode of Locked On Wild and Locked On Blue Jackets is brought to you by FanDuel. Hey, NFL fans, you can start the season with a big return on FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. So when you get a hunch in the middle of the game, you can check out the latest stats, view live play-by-play, and so much more on the same page where you place your bets. You should see my computer when it's fantasy football time and I'm trying to keep my lineup intact throughout the week. 90 different tabs. I've got 4 different ESPN tabs up trying to keep track of the games and see if my players are performing up to expectations. You don't have to do that on FanDuel. It's all in one place. And best of all, you will get started with $200 in bonus bets guaranteed when you place your first $5 bet. Best of all, it doesn't even have to be a winner. You could have had the Pittsburgh Penguins beating the New York Rangers in last night's action. Boy, that was a drubbing. And hey,
What a shame.
it still would have gotten you the $200 in bonus bets because it does not have to be a winner. So head to FanDuel.com right now to take advantage of this great deal. FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Welcome back to today's special crossover edition of Locked On Blue Jackets and Locked On Wild. Once again, we thank you for making both shows your first listen each and every day. And I'll make mention of this for both audiences. We will have some special post-game coverage for you for both Locked On Blue Jackets and Locked On Wild. For Locked On Wild listeners, it'll be a standard post-game that you are accustomed to, but helping Jay out this weekend by putting together some for Locked On Blue Jackets as well. So should be a fun first game here to get these seasons started. And now we shift to some Minnesota Wild discussion. Jay, if you've got any big Minnesota Wild questions or just want to expand upon, I think, what was a pretty solid analysis of this Wild team from the last couple of seasons, I'm an open book. Go ahead and fire away.
Yeah, I guess let's start off with the not quite the elephant in the room, but something that might turn into the elephant in the room throughout the season. Kirill Kaprizov, a star in this league, obviously. How worried are you that he is going to skip town?
You know, honestly, I'm not as worried about him not re-upping with this team as I am about him re-upping and then some point during the contract, during the next contract being like, I can't do this here. There are a lot of factors that work in the Minnesota Wild's favor, namely that they can offer more years and money than any of the other teams on the market. But that's not the whole piece of the puzzle. That's not the whole pie. Like, you have to show that you are a legitimate contender for not only making the playoffs, for that participation ribbon that a lot of teams value quite heavily. You got to show that you're a legitimate Stanley Cup contender. And I think this season is going to be really telling because we go into the season and it seems like the Wild have a much better depth situation than they've had in years past. It seems like they're in a situation where a lot of the spots on this roster have prospects that are ready to step in at either some point this year or definitely next season. And so if you're Bill Guerin, you are pointing to guys like Joel Eriksson, like Matt Boldy, like Marco Rossi, Brock Faber, and saying, all right, this is going to be our next core that you are going to be part of. We're going to go to war with those guys. And the Wild have in their top 10 prospects, probably 6 guys that are not only like pretty close to locks to make the NHL level, but to be high impact players as well. You got Riley Heidt, who was given a chance in preseason to try to potentially make the roster. Now, he didn't look like he's ready at this point, but he still is a tremendously talented scorer that's going to be a top 6 guy. You've got Danila Yurov over in the KHL. Final year that he's going to be there. He'll be on the Wild roster next year. He has top line upside for this Minnesota Wild team. You've got Liam Ogren, who we'll see at points this year, and depending on how things go with Marcus Johansson, we may see him a lot this season. And so it's kind of a 1-2 approach. Is we've got this core that we're building around. We've got some quality players that may not be like in that inner ring, but are definitely in the supporting cast. And Bill Guerin just has to hope and trust that those guys will perform up to the level that they need to. And then at that point, you go to Kirill and you say, we want you to be the bullseye. We want you to be right in the middle as the focal piece to what this team is building. And at that point, he'll either re-up or we have to look at whatever comes next. But I think I'm pretty confident that he will sign on the dotted line It just depends on what the team looks like around him.
Yeah, for sure. Which is something I wanted to talk about as well, actually, because something that I've always admired about the Wild is, despite the fact that they usually finish kind of drafting between 16 and 24 overall, somehow they've picked up a lot of really solid prospects, like a lot of the guys you just mentioned. I love Liam Öhgren. Jesper Wallstedt, I think, is my favorite goalie prospect in the game right now. I think he's spectacular, and you picked him up 20th overall somehow.
Yep.
And then on top of that, obviously you pick up Brock Faber in the trade with LA, which I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, that was the Kevin Fiala trade, which sucks to give up a guy like Kevin Fiala, but then Brock Faber comes in and does what he does last season. The future seems really bright in Minnesota in a way that kind of has snuck up on a lot of people, I think. Is there something is there a final piece that needs to click into place for the Wild to take that next step, do you think? Because I feel like they've been consistently, I feel like they have been consistently a playoff team.
Yeah.
And also consistently a playoff team that goes between 5 and 7 games and then says, see you later. Do they have the pieces in the organization to take that next step? And is that next step this year?
I love that you asked this question, because it feels like there's a pretty easy component that needs to be upgraded for this Wild team to really take the next step. Second line, right wing. Because look, your top 6 right now is Kirill Kaprizov, Marco Rossi, Matt Zuccarello. I know Matt Zuccarello is getting up there in age, but with that trio together, he led the Wild in points this preseason with 8, and he played 3 games. Joel Eriksson Ek and Matt Boldy have great chemistry together. The missing piece is going to be they've had Marcus Johansson fill that spot, and I charted it last year. He had 40, I think the actual number was 47 games in which he had 1 shot or fewer on net. You just can't have that type of production from that spot. Your second line needs to be able to complementary score to take pressure off your first line. If they can get somebody to come in there and to just take Matt Boldy and Joel Eriksson Ek to new heights, whether it be Liam Öhgren, whether it be, which by the way, the Brock Faber trade, that first round pick that they got in addition to Brock Faber, Liam Öhgren.
Tidy work from the Wild. Again, I love Kevin Fiala. What a stupid good trade that turned out for the Wild. Yeah,
that is one. I think that is one. And, Fiala's been really good in the regular season for the Kings since he went there. Obviously, he has kind of disappeared in the postseason as he did here. But it's one of those things where for what he's been paid, Kevin Fiala has produced at that level, but we're just scratching the surface with what Brock Faber can bring to the table. Like you're talking about a guy who I think as his offense improves, he's going to be a steady, 12 to 15 goal, 50 to 60 point defenseman, which is outrageous value. Like getting a guy like that. Oh, and drafting Zeev Buium with the 12th overall pick, calling Philadelphia and saying
extremely good work.
Yeah,
I forgot about Buium. Again, my highest ranked defenseman in this draft was Zeev Buium.
Just add that, sprinkle that in, and that'll be 2 years down the line. That'll be your top pairing, Faber and Buium, and that's
disgusting. I'm so glad that the Blue Jackets play in the East.
So it's like you look at all that, and I did an episode earlier in the offseason where I looked at a year down the line. If you make 3 tweaks to this roster, 3 tweaks to this lineup, you're getting really close. So I would say they are definitely a top 6 scorer away. But as they add these prospects in, you get Jesper Wallstedt in the lineup regularly. You get Zeev Buium in the lineup regularly. This is going to be a team that is going to be a problem. It's just a matter of the transition, which is always a little bumpy because you've got these veterans taking up roster spots. As long as they perform, they'll probably keep those spots open. When they start to not, that's then when we could see some of these prospects take those roles over.
100%. Brand new head coach. Let's finish up with that. Obviously, the Dean Evason of it all we've discussed. You've got John Hines in, who would not have been my first choice, I don't think. But how is he gelling with the team? Is he the guy that can? Because I feel like the criticism of Everson was that he couldn't win in the playoffs. Is John Hines a guy that can, again, take these guys to the next step? Take them to the second round, the third round, potentially further on. How are we feeling about John Hines in general?
I think you hit it right on the head. Is people are kind of meh on John Hines as a coach. I talked to Matt Boldy for an episode that will be airing here today as well. The players like him. They like John Hines. He I think is a little more demanding than Dean was at points. I've heard from a handful of players just how tough the preseason was, how tough training camp was. It was physically demanding, because I think one of the very subtle tweaks that John Hines made that did make a difference was not trying to be like we're going to slow you down and physically like wear you down type team. Like we're going to try to go the opposite way of almost every other team in the league. He came in and he kind of realized we do need to play more of that modern style, even though we might not have as much speed as other teams do. And so I think that has allowed the Wild to more evenly compete with a lot of teams, except the rest of the Central Division. But I like some of the in-game tweaks that he makes. He's one of those. I call him a battle general, a tactician. Like he makes tweaks in game that I really like. Obviously, the one that got all the headlines last year was when we were playing Nashville late in the season. Game was tied in overtime. He pulls Marc-Andre Fleury for the extra attacker, and the Wild end up getting the 2 points. And had Nashville scored with the empty net, you don't get any points. And so I like that he is willing to put it all on the line, because I can very confidently say that that's something that Dean would not have done. So I like that he does that. I like that he kind of he seems like he has a really good pulse of what's going on during the game, to where he may say, okay, Kirill, I'm going to put you with these guys for a shift in the third period to see if we can throw another wrinkle at the opponent that they're not ready for. I like some of that stuff, but ultimately, like you said, it comes down to, can you win in the postseason? So far, he has not. Will a Wild team that has had a lot of failure in the postseason recently be the perfect match for a coach that has had no postseason success himself? Is that the big equalizer that leads to a deep playoff run? I guess we'll see, but I like a lot of what I see. I like pieces of what I see. I just need to see a little more.
Yeah, which it's game one. And we're talking a big game about how we're not sure if Dean Evason can do this or that, or if John Hines can do this or that. We haven't even seen game one yet.
Right.
Dean Evason specifically, we have 8 preseason games of evidence for what's going on. It's fine. Calm down, folks. I know that the Wild fans are probably just as temperamental, shall we say, about how the team is doing, but relax. It's going to be fine, guys. I promise. And if it's not, then you can figure that out 2 months down the road.
Yeah.
Don't worry about it. I promise nothing bad is going to happen.
I have taken a new tone this year, and I frequently use the phrase, I have to trust, in that if there's something that I don't like about the lineup or about a particular player in a particular spot, I have to trust that Bill Guerin is going to see that. And if a particular player isn't holding their end of the bargain into the season this year, I have to trust that there are going to be changes made. And so, it's if I've learned anything doing this, as I'm sure you can attest as well, it's a long season. Like,
it's so long. Yeah.
There's a lot of butter. There's a lot of toast. You got to spread the butter to make it last the entire year. So we'll see. but I'm sure there are some interesting wrinkles, and I know there are because we're going to get into them next as we dive a little deeper into the game itself. And so we'll finish by taking a look at game one tonight between the Wild and the Blue Jackets. That's on the way as we finish today's special crossover edition of Locked On Blue Jackets and Locked On Wild after this.
First, though, we got to talk about GameTime. I love using GameTime. I love going to live hockey. I love to go to last-minute live hockey as well. Being here in California at the minute, the Sharks were real bad last season, so I went to a bunch of last-minute Sharks games, and it was great, and I got all of my tickets at GameTime. They've got the most flexible customer service policy in the industry. They've got their lowest price guarantee, which means GameTime is going to credit you 110% of the difference. If you find tickets in your section and row for less on another site, you get a panoramic view from your seat in the app before you buy. And this is my favorite bit. They've got all-in pricing. So if you toggle this on, you're not going to get any of those stupid surprise fees at checkout that we get on some other ticketing services, which will remain nameless. All-in pricing. That's by far my favorite thing that GameTime does. It's cheaper than other sites. It's better than other sites. It's easier to use than other sites. So take the guesswork out of buying tickets with GameTime. Download the GameTime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off. Download GameTime today. What time is it? GameTime.
One final segment of today's crossover edition of Locked On Blue Jackets and Locked On Wild. And again, we thank you for making both shows your first listen each and every day. We are also your team each and every day. And whether you watch on YouTube or listen on one of your favorite audio platforms, we don't care where, we care that you do. So we thank you for being loyal listeners, everydayers, and part of the lineup here at Locked On. All right. Let's talk a little bit about the game tonight, because I think you brought up what is a really key narrative to this game is how are the Wild going to handle all of the extra emotion that's going to be out there on the ice in the game. Obviously, I would imagine the Wild are going to do some sort of a tribute, moment of silence type thing. The emotion's going to be flowing from the Columbus side of the ice pretty much all night because, his teammates are going to be thinking about him while they're out there. So it puts the Wild in a situation where you have to kind of try to navigate that. And it is going to be something you can't really plan for. So it wouldn't surprise me if this ends up being a much closer game than expected. I think a lot of people go into this and are like, yeah, the Wild should take care of it 4-1, 3-0, something like that. I think this is going to be a 1-goal game, and it's just going to be a matter of the Minnesota Wild kind of trying to persevere. Is kind of how I come into this one.
Yeah, I think the key is going to be, how do the Wild, like we talked about the emotions, how do the Wild deal with that? Do they try and match that emotion? Or do they try and not rise above it necessarily, but if things start getting, things start getting emotional, players start getting kind of, I don't want to say highly strung because that feels a bit derivative, but I think there's going to be some short tempers in this game. How do the Wild match that? And it's easy to get caught up in that kind of emotion. And I think if the Wild let the Blue Jackets dictate the pace, it's going to be a long night for them. Again, we don't know what the Blue Jackets are going to do in tonight's game. We don't know how they're going to come out. Are they going to be, dealing with the grief? Are they going to fall apart? Are they going to struggle with it? Are they going to band together? We don't know. The Wild don't know. It's going to be, I keep going back to that. How do you prepare to play a game like that? Later on in the season, it'll get easier as more and more teams have faced the Blue Jackets and figured out what's going on, as teams know what kind of team the Blue Jackets are. It's going to be tough. And I think the Wild are really going to have to, they're going to have to figure out how to keep that emotion in check. I think they have to play their game and not get caught up in the swell of emotions. And it's going to be an emotional night for them as well, because like we talked about, Johnny Gaudreau, universally loved. We even, no one likes to talk ill of the dead, obviously. But even before that, we never heard stories about like this one dude that Johnny Gaudreau was mean to one time. It's every single person to a man loved this guy.
Yeah.
And there are going to be players on the Wild that knew Gaudreau, that played with him, that played against him, that, friends of friends, because hockey is the smallest world imaginable. Like, it's going to be an emotional night for everyone. And I think it really is going to come down to, can the Wild control the emotion, or do they get swept up in it?
Yeah, that's a great point. I pulled the results from last year, and both games went to overtime.
Of course.
The Wild won one, the Blue Jackets won the other. It was one of the first games of the season. It was game 5, in fact, for both teams, and the Wild lost 5-4 in OT. 54 shots on goal for Columbus, and I think
normal.
you mentioned
Normal shot.
72 shot attempts,
yeah,
which is
fine.
It's just, I vividly remember being at that game up in the press box, just looking around. Like, seems like the Blue Jackets are possessing the puck almost exclusively in this one. But that was, this will be interesting because that was when the Wild were still playing kind of the slow, grinded out type of game. Obviously, later in the season, I think it was Kirill Kaprizov who had the, if I recall, he had, or no, that was the 2-goal Matt Boldy game in the second matchup, and so he had a good game. That's what it was. Kirill Kaprizov did not play, and so Matt Boldy stepped in and took the lead, and the Wild ended up being able to win that matchup. But Columbus, I'm sure, still has plenty of speed, and so the Wild need to be aware of that. They need to be able to match that, and don't get caught on your end of the ice for 3.5 minutes.
Easier said than done, I think. Yeah, it's going to be interesting because I feel like if Dean Evason comes in, and again, we don't know what he's going to do. I have liked what I've seen from the Blue Jackets systems in preseason. I think they have looked a lot more structured. They've looked, dare I say, competent in their own end, which I don't think they looked at all competent at any point last season in their own end. Whether that's due to Dean Evason, whether that's due to different personnel, etc. Like, this is going to be a completely different roster than the Wild faced last year.
Yeah.
And even before the obviously losing Gaudreau, losing Jenner and Voronkov to injuries, Don Waddell, the new GM, was very clear. He was like, there's going to be half a dozen new faces on this roster this season. Guys that haven't played for the Blue Jackets before, guys that haven't played in the NHL before, really. Like, James Van Riemsdyk is on the team now. I don't know if you guys remember that signing that they kind of made after realizing that they needed bodies. Kevin Labanc is here. Zach Aston Reese claimed on waivers a couple of days ago. Jake Christiansen, a longtime Cleveland Monster in the AHL, has made the opening night roster and is going to be playing. A lot of new faces for this team. This is going to be a completely different team than the Wild faced last season. So I don't think they can go into it expecting to see the same result.
Yeah.
I do feel like these teams go to overtime against each other way more than is normal, considering they only play each other twice a year. Because I vividly remember, I want to say it was like 2018 or 2019, I was in Minnesota for the Blue Jackets game. Alex Wennberg, overtime winner, a controversial one. I think the puck might have gone in off his glove. Longtime Wild fans will may or may not remember that. I was delighted by it, and so were the other 4 Blue Jackets fans in attendance in the entirety of the XL. But I wouldn't be surprised if this game goes to overtime. And then it's the score resets.
Yeah,
it's 0-0. Which we talked about this a little bit off mic. I wanted to kind of have some fun with it.
Sure.
Because why not? We have fun here at Locked On Blue Jackets. We have fun at Locked On Wild. Predictions. And so I'm going to ask you, Seth, what's the final score going to be? And who's going to score the game-winning goal?
I think I'm going to go 4-3. I think the Minnesota Wild win. Like I said, this has a tight game written all over it because I think it's going to be tense. Emotions are going to run high, and I don't think the Wild are going to pull away in this one. If they win it, I honestly could see Columbus coming away on the winning side in this one too. But I think it'll be 4-3. I think you're going to get the game winner from Matt Boldy. But I think Kirill Kaprizov is going to factor in quite a bit. 1 or 2 from him, too.
That seems extremely likely based on... I don't have the numbers directly in front of me, but he had almost 100 points last season. I think there were probably very few games that he did not feature on the score sheet. So
yeah, it was
having
rare.
a Kaprizov point or a goal or a couple of goals seems extremely likely to me. I am going to be a homer. I debated picking the Wild to win this game. But I've decided that if I don't believe in the Blue Jackets, who will? So I'm going to go with, I think it's going to be a 3-2 win for the Blue Jackets. I think it's going to go to overtime because, again, like I said, these teams always seem to go to overtime because they do not care for my blood pressure or sleep schedule. But I'm going to go with, again, I'm like, man, who is even on the roster right now because everyone is injured. I'm going to pick our own Kirill the Thrill, and I think Kirill Marchenko is going to pot the game winner for the Blue Jackets in overtime. Do I think it's going to be a good goal? No, I think it's going to be the stupidest goal you've ever seen. But they don't ask how, they ask how many, So we'll see who's right in probably about 12 hours after you guys have listened to this.
Yeah, that very much tracks because the first goal that Philip Gustafsson gave up in the preseason, it deflected off of Marco Rossi's stick, went straight at the goal, and went over Philip Gustafsson's head into the net. So
beautiful game.
Yeah, there is just disastrous puck luck that rears its ugly head. And so that would not surprise me in the slightest. But that is going to do it for today's episode. Again, reminder for both Locked On Wild and Locked On Blue Jackets fans, we'll have you covered for the post game. So it'll be a fully encompassed post game for both shows after Thursday's game. So you'll be able to hear that on both channels, live on Locked On Wild, and then next day for Locked On Blue Jackets. So that should be a lot of fun. And we hope you enjoyed today's episode, and make sure to follow along with both shows, which we have for you every Monday through Friday as part of the Locked On Podcast Network.